So we want to talk about soil health and why it's important. Soil microbes, which is really the key to this whole system. And that's the key when we talk about transitioning to no-till, is where we are with our soil microbes. Cover crops is definitely a part of this system. If we talked about cover crops 10, 15 years ago when we really promoted no-till in Pennsylvania, we'd be much further today. And I'm sure it would be further here in New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and the New England states too, if we really talked about this system. The toughest thing is for someone that's tried this, and I don't think there's anybody in this room that's done this, is for a farmer to try this and fail, and then you go back and say, well, let's try this again. And farmers don't want to do that. Even though we have equipment today that's much, much better, our seeds can deal with the environment a lot better than they could back when we tried no-till before. The chemistry, the soil fertility, everything has improved today. And that ties into the cover crops too. Now, one of the big things we learned from the Dakotas was diversity. They probably have 8 or 10 different primary crops in the Dakotas. So they have a lot of diversity there. When you go out to eat, why would you go to a buffet? To get diversity. Okay? And probably to eat more than you should. That's part of the reason I go. Or I should, whatever. But anyhow, diversity. Microbes need diversity. Both to increase their numbers, but also to increase more different species of microbes in the soil. That's what helps our soil, helps us move another level higher in managing soil and soil health. And we can't go in there and rotate tillage. We have to say, I'm not going to do any tillage there. We can talk about starting out, what kind of condition the soil is in when we start. Maybe we need to do a one-time subsoiling pass. We actually have 2 fields. So I sort of lied to you a while ago. We actually had 2 fields that were heavier soil that about 12 years ago we went in and subsoiled once. And that was just when I was starting to get into cover crops. And I promised myself I'm always going to plant a cover crop after soybeans in that field, because that was our weakest link in our system. And I always did, and the data broke us right down. One-time tillage, subsoiling did what had to be done there. So I did lie to you a little bit. But what usually happens is you go for 3 or 4 years and it's just working along and everything's fine. Then you get 1 year in there, it's tough. The soil, maybe it's dry, the soil's hard, you can't get the planter in the ground. Maybe you don't get good emergence. Yeah, well, gotta get the plow out. And then you start all over again. You've got to sometimes get through a tough year somewhere in that sequence. See, the first couple years you no-till, the soil still is a little bit looser maybe because of the tillage, but as time goes on, you're not loosening it with tillage, and if the microbes aren't there, then that's when that gets tough, maybe the 3rd and 4th year. But with this system, we don't have to worry near as much about that. I frankly don't think we should have any yield drag even with corn if we use the system's approach to it. Okay, learning from others, and I kind of hinted at that already with you folks. Try to get out and see some of these things in different places. Not throwing any rocks, but Cornell is not really promoting no-till. They promote soil health, but they don't really promote no-till. And so Vermont, I was very impressed with the folks in Vermont a couple months ago when I was there. I really worked hand in hand with some of the Vermont researchers, and they seem to get it. They seem to really understand what this is all about. So I was very impressed. If you're looking for research data or anything, I would go to the University of Vermont for that. They actually have some data published that shows you can shorten the length of silage corn, the day length of silage corn, and get as good a yields as you do with longer length silage corn varieties. And that normally isn't, I didn't expect that. Steve Groff's found that in Pennsylvania with grain corn and with soybeans. One way to get the cover crop in easier is to grow shorter season corn and beans, or any other crop for that matter, with beans and corn as the primary ones. And Steve's proving that we can actually maybe get better yields sometimes with shorter season crops. But silage corn, if we break even, I figure we're good. Silage corn, if we get it off and get a cover crop in, maybe triticale or rye, and we harvest that the following spring, which that's okay to harvest that, we're ahead. We may offset that even a little bit of decrease in yield with what we get from the cereal rye or triticale is something to feed the cows with. And I have some other things on that too. Is there any dairy? Is there anybody dairy in here? Guess we know you was talking about that.
Once upon a time I was, but that was
Okay.
long ago.
Well, basically, I'll just say it right now while I just an overview. The people that grow silage corn for 3, 4, 5 years, or maybe continuous silage corn, if every third year, for example, they put a cover crop after the silage corn, harvest that in the spring, plant the sorghum or sorghum sudan grass, get 2 cuttings from that for forage, put the cover crop in the fall again, and then go back and maybe harvest that in the spring, and then go back to a couple more years of silage corn. Break up that continuous silage corn cycle. And I think sorghum's one good crop to do that. So what we learned on these 2 Dakota trips, and I kid people, I say I'm a slow learner, I had to go twice. But I went the second time because I kind of felt I was the organizer and I should be there, plus I enjoyed it. They identified their concerns, what their resource concerns were out in North Dakota. And they did diversity in cover crops, in their cropping systems. They did the soil armor, keeping the soil protected year-round. And their goal was to have good soil health. The thinking is if we have good soil health, we will produce good quality plants, and we'll have good crops, and we'll also have more nutritious crops. Jill Clapper, and I mentioned her name earlier, she had done quite a bit of research, and she really found that the way we can produce better quality food or crops from livestock was to have good, healthy soil. And part of that's having the nutrients in the soil to grow the good crops, but to have that system. And again, it's a system approach. Now stop me anywhere here. This is Burleigh County. If you go on the internet and Google Burleigh County, that's one on the back of my last page handout, but they have a farm there. They actually do research there. NRCS, and they work hand in hand. You don't know whether you're talking to an NRCS person or a district person there. They just work that closely together. Frankly, I don't know how it works in New Hampshire, but in general, what happens, districts can impact what NRCS does as an agency in your county or in your counties. No NRCS people here, are there? No. And I would say it anyway, in a kind sense. But frankly, what they did in Burleigh County, they told NRCS, we don't want you to build waterways, and we don't want you to do this other stuff. We want you to make the soil healthy. If you make the soil healthy, we won't need those waterways. Now, I'm over-exaggerating a bit, but the point was they wanted NRCS to do related to soil health more than some of the Band-Aid approaches, things that they're typical done and everyone's done. So I'm not throwing rocks at NRCS, but I'm saying you folks have some power to, within your districts, to guide NRCS in what you want to see them do. And if you think soil health is important, they're a living example of how that can be done. You talk to, you can go online, you can get the district folks' names, and talk to them about that. So they hosted us. They fed us more than one meal while we were out there, and they drive the district NRCS van. They hauled us around the first time, and that's kind of something you wouldn't expect could even happen. But they had a district person drive us down to South Dakota to join Beck's research farm. One day, that was a 16-hour day, but it was a very, very good day. This is one of the farmers. Jay Fuhrer, in the center background there, actually is ready to retire from NRCS, and he's now gotten permission in Dakota to be a soil health person. So he's fully working in soil health. You might be able to work through NRCS here to get Jay to come in and do a program or do some programs. Jay is at the field level. He's not a farmer, but he knows. He's working one-on-one with the farmers. He's been to Pennsylvania half a dozen times. And Jay would be an excellent person, resource person, to try to hook up with. The other possibility is maybe get some folks to go to North Dakota and see the Menokum farm and see it firsthand. We got one county, we had district and NRCS both out there in this trip last year, and I'm hoping they can kind of work down the road like these folks are. I think you probably have an idea what soil health is. Maybe you can answer that better than I do, but its primary functions to support plant and animal production. Soil's alive. How many pounds of microbes might you find in the soil? In the plow depth in an acre. You can have over a ton. You can have over 2,000 pounds. I have a slide in it that kind of addresses that. But when you think, and that's counting earthworms and night crawlers, and you say, well, that adds up pretty fast. You don't need too many earthworms and night crawlers to make a ton. The majority of the population is not earthworms and night crawlers. It's the things you have to have a microscope to see. So that means there's millions, literally millions of microbes in the soil when we have a good situation for them. And they have to eat, and they have to have a place to hide. And the diversity, has an impact in that whole microbial population and getting the right ones there too. Okay, this, you've probably seen, this is a typical slide that shows physical, chemical, and biological properties of the soil in terms of soil health. We've done pretty good with the physical, and we've done pretty good with the chemical, but the biological has always gotten kind of left behind for the most part. And a lot of people have overcome weaknesses in biology by putting on extra nutrients. They push the soil that way to get the yield, but it's cost a lot more. It's cost a lot more money, and we can't have more pollution if we got poor soils that aren't healthy where we have a lot of runoff. This just shows, again, we add organic matter. You increase the biological activity, diversity. It may reduce soil-borne. Is there a pointer in this?
No, it's just a mouse.
And that would probably be more dangerous because I do bad things with these and pointers. Can reduce soil-borne diseases. We're looking right now at some of the benefits of healthy soil in terms of reducing pesticides, insecticides, and herbicide across the board, really, reducing the outside inputs. You get your decomposition over there of your organic matter. You get better aggregation, pore structures improved. That's what we're seeing here versus over there. Nutrients released, humus formed. One thing, if you're starting into a system, make sure you do at least a soil test that has soil organic matter, so you know what your soil organic matter levels are when you start. It can be a garden, it can be anything. But get that base information. Cornell does have a good soil health test that you can use as a baseline indicator. And there's also a testing facility in Maine now that's doing, I'll think of it later. At the moment I can't think of it, but they're doing, it's soil health related tests. And I'll think of it. I don't know, it's not in my slide talk anywhere. But they've done a bunch of programs in Pennsylvania on that, had folks come in. There's definitely a speaker in Maine that could talk about that for you. Stop me if you have questions. Hey, they're all different. They all look different, but they're out there, and many more. How I did that. Okay, here's a slide that gives kind of the abundance, and actually 2001 ton is on the low side, and it can go up to 27. That would be 13 tons of microbes. I forgot my number in my head there, but this just lists some of the more common ones. But you see the amount of earthworms there compared to some of the small ones, the fungi and the bacteria and so forth. It's amazing. Plant relationships. I always kind of learned that if you have two plants there, neither one will do well because they're in competition with one another. But there's a lot that isn't true in a lot of cases. What happens when plants compete with one another, the impact of diversity in weed populations, the COVID experience with cover crop mixtures, mycorrhizal fungi. Essentially what they do, and I'm not the expert on it, but they extend the root system of the plant. So they will help the plant get microbes, and there's a relationship between grasses and legumes with the mycorrhizal fungi where the grass will get some nitrogen from the legumes, and the legumes will get some phosphorus from the grasses through the mycorrhizal fungi activity. So that's a whole area you could have a 2-hour talk on. I'll just keep moving here and we'll touch on a few of those things. Here, this is a slide that shows that really. You have the legume on the right and the grasses on the left, and it just discusses moving the nitrogen from the legume to the grass plant and vice versa. And those fine things in between here are not actually roots. That's the mycorrhizae that facilitate that movement of those materials. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg with that. Now, we get concerned here, and I can understand it. No-till, good residue on the surface, maybe even cover crop out there. My soil's not going to warm up in the spring. It's going to be a disaster. Okay? Couple things. This looks at the issue of warm temperature and moisture utilization during the summer months. And essentially, if we have that cover out there, we're going to avoid those 130, 140, maybe 100 degree soil temperatures where moisture uptake is very inefficient. The other thing, I don't think I have a slide in here on it. There is a slide out there that I should put in here. It's a winter picture. I'm not sure if it's early spring or early winter, but two fields side by side. One has a cover crop and one doesn't. And in essence, the one that has the cover crop, the snow, it's like an inch or two of snow. The snow is pretty well all melted where the cover crop was, and the other field that was bare, the snow is there. That's the activity of the microbes where we have the cover crop. A prime example of that, you go out, well, I dug these cover crops, same thing happens. Where do you find the earthworms and night crawlers? In those roots where those covers are. So there's two sides to this discussion about how using soil armor can keep our soil temperatures cool in the spring when we plant. Something we have to deal with. And that's why we have some row cleaners and we have some other things to help us. But there's some pluses to that too. This isn't new. We don't have to reinvent the wheel on a lot of this stuff. We just have to go back. It's interesting how some of the older textbooks actually have, some of this information in them, but it's been forgotten. And I didn't talk much about, but we can, through cover cropping, reduce some of our purchased inputs. If we can grow a legume cover crop, we can grow some nitrogen for a grass crop, for a grass hay crop, or for a corn crop. If we use a deep-rooted cover crop, maybe even the tillage radishes to some extent, we may pull some nutrients out of the soil that otherwise would have been lost or were too deep for the crop we grow to get. So we can reduce some nutrient inputs by having this soil health. Just a mixture of different seeds. I hear different people say, well, they went to the barn and they had this and they had that, and they threw it together and planted it. And it worked. There's no magic. Don't get hung up on mixtures with cover crops. I'll show you a slide. I'm not sure the handouts that you have. If you should have the one where the chart that I'll show you here. And as far as setting your drill for that stuff, I usually look at get the best setting I can for each seed mixture or each seed that I have in there, And if I've got 10 different seeds, I'll put 10%, I'll put 10% of each one in to come up with my seeding rate per acre. It's no magic. There's some plants that won't work. They'll dominate. There's others that won't make it at that seeding rate. One thing we found is we're probably seeding cover crop too heavy a seeding rate to let the individual different species really do their thing. I have 7 acres of food plot from my timber harvest, so I do my wildlife food plot kind of as I play with cover crops in there, one and the same thing. I cut my rate back like I thought it should be for cover crop. Well, of course, the deer and the wildlife I didn't take that into account, so I can't cut back that much where I'm trying to feed deer too. But you can cut back. For example, the tillage radishes are fairly expensive. I use about 2 pounds of tillage radish per acre with a mixture of whatever else I'm planting, annual ryegrass. I have used annual ryegrass, tillage radish, and then winter grain, rye, cereal rye, or whatever, if I get it in early enough. You can't get radishes like I have there. Those were planted at least a month ago. You can't get them if you plant now. And here they should be planted probably mid-August, very late, 1st of September, to get anything. Interesting enough, they found some data in wheat production where the first time this happened, somebody had some radishes in their grain drill when they planted the wheat, and they got a bump in wheat yield. Now, those radishes had to be planted pretty late. So there's something possibly going on there we don't really understand, and you don't have to have those big tubers to get something benefit from your radishes. They've tried since. Steve Groff actually had a bunch of those out on farms across the country, and I honestly don't remember what his research showed last year. It wasn't like across the board, it's going to always be good, but it's almost like it might be worthwhile to at least try it. Yeah.
The UNH field trials with radish following with sorghum sudan grass, you could see in the aerial imagery that the plots where they had the radish equaled the legume crops, meaning that they were scavenging as much nitrogen as the legumes were fixing the following spring.
That's interesting.
It's pretty dramatic. I mean, they're still completing those trials, but each year it's very dramatic.
I'm glad to hear that. That's,
so I could share those pictures
sure.
with you. It's pretty,
oh, sure.
Yeah.
That's neat.
And there's a lot. They're doing a lot that fall, picking up the.
And that's nitrogen. It's probably going to cause a pollution problem somewhere.
Right.
So, and I don't know, is there any research being done where we're looking at the legume being there and the radish taking up the nitrogen from the legume?
From the legume, yeah. Well, I know that there's, they're doing some of the legume radish mixes.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, sure, with the clover.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, we're just tip of the iceberg of this stuff. And you go home and you're confused, and you may be. But don't be afraid to just try something in your backyard, or try an acre, or try something. What works for me isn't going to work for you, and however many people there are here, there's 10 different ways to do this. And it depends a lot on your soil, your management, and one other thing I want to say so I don't forget. A lot of this stuff, folks, is up here. Our biggest enemy is this is the way we always did it. I'm talking about no-till primarily, but the whole thing, the cover crops and everything. If you mentally say this is going to work, you go home and you make a commitment, or you say to your wife, this is going to work, I'll guarantee you it'll work. But if you go home and, hell, I'm going to, because he said something, I'm going to go out and do something, but I don't think it'll work. I'll guarantee it won't work. You got to get yourself to where you're convinced it's going to work, and it will work. I guarantee you it will work. Okay. Just some comments relevant to the mixtures and so forth. Again, trying to get a crop off earlier to get fall planting of covers. I talked about shorter season. Now, I do something that probably no one, I will say that because there are people doing it. I said I planted all my stuff on November 4th last year. I planted rye into corn stalks when we were growing corn yet in November. I planted rye into soybeans last year. I did that in November. It's not there in the fall. but come spring, it's going to be there. The snow melts, it's going to be there. Now, I'm not advocating that if you don't have residue on a field. If you've got a bare field, you need to get something out there timely and get cover in the fall. But like the soybeans, we had some residue there, but we needed to have more cover in the spring. And it will work. I call it a dormant seeding, so no one expects to see anything till spring. I usually will see drill rows, but everyone doesn't do it. It's too late because the agencies all said, well, you got to plant it by a certain date. And I understand that if you have a bare field. But you can do a lot of good by planting the cover crop late, especially if you're putting manure out there in that field. That picture back here, and I would assume that Penn State's not the only one that's done some of this work, but this was a Doug Beagle slide. He's our soil fertility person in Pennsylvania. He shows when the corn takes up the nitrogen. And essentially what this shows is, I almost saw the cover crop and manure in the fall kind of being the key, but here's the amount of nitrogen taken up in the fall by a cover crop from manure, and here's the spring uptake. The bulk of it's taken up in the spring. If you get that cover crop in, even though it's a dormant seeding, and it's out there when things start to warm up in the spring, you're going to get a lot of nutrients taken up in the spring. And that could apply where you have a legume or other situations too. So this is something I'm surprised more districts that promote cover crop and so forth haven't looked at this kind of, the way this all works. Okay, we can talk more about that individually. Seeding depths, I got little tiny seeds. You're not supposed to plant them deeper than the thickness of the seed or half the thickness of the seed. And I got oats or wheat or whatever. Corn, I even mix a little corn with my food plots, and you can do it in your cover crop if you have it. I seed it somewhere around an inch deep. And you've got enough seeds in that row, folks. I think the small ones are going to come up because you've got the bigger seeds, kind of breaking the crust if there is anything like that and so forth. So I've never gotten really hung up on it. And I don't beat the drill up. 3 weeks ago I planted wheat after alfalfa. It was powder dry. Well, I probably got 3/4 of the wheat in the ground, or maybe a little more than that. I didn't beat the drill up to get every grain of wheat in the soil. It's a cover crop, and I have some pictures on my camera, which I didn't bring it. But anyhow, you don't have to get that wheat or that rye in 2 inches deep as a cover crop. You get it in, and then you get moisture. We got moisture now, and the wheat's up. Well, I think one of those, actually there is that wheat. I can show you that. So no magic to it, just do something. The cocktails, again, just the whole thing with the mixture, different food for the microbes, talking about the soil armor there, soil temperature, soil moisture, capturing. The other thing is, we talk about is keeping something green out there in the land as much as we possibly can when there's growing season. The soil gains energy from the sunlight, but only if there's a green plant out there to take it in. So we like to see, now this goes against planting the late cover crop as far as not having anything green in the fall, but it's still better to have something green early in the spring than no green at all. So the idea of trying to have something out there green on our fields as much of the time as we can is a goal that kind of fits with this whole concept here. I'll just go through these. You can read these yourselves. Here's a chart that Gerard Troisi, our crop consultant, he only consults with no-till farmers, and he's actually just recently hired 2 more people to work with him. He's really into this stuff big time. But here you have your different groups. You have your growth cycles. You look at them. The water use, the architecture of the plant in terms of roots, and basically you've got your broadleaves, grass, and your you've got the warm and cool season here. I'm trying to sort that out. Well, okay, here's your warm season's over there and your cool season's here. You should have a warm and cool season grass and a warm and cool season broadleaf. And they say broadleaf because what's buckwheat, for example? It's not a legume, it's not a grass. So buckwheat, and buckwheat's not a bad cover to throw in there if you get it planted early enough. But that's, you should have this chart in your handouts, and that's something to look at and try to pick, grasses and legumes, cool season, warm season. There you've got 4 different things to start with if you just get one of each of those. Okay? It may depend when you're planting that, if you can do this completely or not. It may not work to do it completely. But just a little bit to get you started. This is 4 mixtures that they had out at the Dakotas. You should have this in your handout. They tried to keep things around $20 an acre or less, just to be, practical from a cost standpoint. You can see there, $19, $10 over there. And what they do, they use some of the bigger seeds, the cheaper seeds in these mixes to keep that price reasonable. And they use smaller amounts of some of the other seeds. So there's no magic to these. It's just 4 that we kind of captured from out there and made a record of them. Planting in the green cover. By planting in the green cover, some of the benefits are we can get more biomass from our cover crop. If you're growing clover, you can get more nitrogen from it. If you have more biomass out there, you have more residue. By planting green, we've had residue. Actually, the last year we grew corn, we had soil cover that was almost 100% up and through the corn canopy. It was just that dense. That was alfalfa plus Angler ryegrass and had some radishes in it. But so you get better cover as a mulch, as a weed suppression, reducing soil erosion. You have the potential to increase nitrogen from the cover, as I said, letting the clover or legume grow longer. The one down here about green cover and drying out your soils, I'm assuming you have some years when it's pretty wet to get in and plant in the spring. Is that true in general? That cover crop helps you manage your moisture. What happens if it's a wet year and you kill that cover crop and it's wet for the next couple of weeks? Is your soil ever going to dry out after you kill the cover crop and it's mulching it? The green cover crop will suck moisture out. Adams County, which is south central Pennsylvania, down near the Maryland, it's next to the Maryland border, they were not going to be able to no-till down there. That was my biggest challenge a number of years ago. And Dwayne Beck, the person from South Dakota, Dakota Lakes Research Farm, same person was out on our no-till alliance. We did that 2 days in a row. He talked to them about drying, managing moisture with cover crops. And within 5 years, now they had a district employee who really worked hard to make this happen. Within 5 years, they were up to 50%, I think about 50% no-till, by using the cover crop to manage moisture. Conversely, if it's a dry year, I have already killed the cover crop early because I was really getting nervous. And I remember one year we planted a different angle in the field with the cover crop than we did when we planted the beans. And probably for the first month, I could see the beans weren't as good where the soil was dry in the cover crop. But until the end of the season, it was at least equal, if not the cover crop was a benefit, even though we had it a little drier early. So you got to watch. You got to play like playing the lottery a little bit on this cover crop if it's going to rain or not. But there's no one way to do it. Do you have slug issues? If you have slug issues, that's the biggest thing that pushed this planting green. Gerard Troisi, the crop consultant I mentioned, I think it was about 5 years ago, Union County, which is east of Center County, one county actually, tremendous issue with slugs. They were eating the cover crop in the fall. Anyway, we had this meeting in, I think, late May or early June. There were about 30 farmers there. Consensus from that whole group was if I planted into a green cover crop, the slugs didn't eat my crops. The slugs would rather eat the cover crop than they would the corn or soybeans. And that's, Penn State's kind of seeing that now. They actually got a grant to do some research on planting green. We're actually going to have a field in that this year.
And when you're saying planting into green, means you're not using an herbicide to kill before you plant?
Not before. We're using herbicide when we plant or within a week after we plant.
But you're
Yes.
still using herbicide?
We're still using herbicides, yeah. Of course, the one thing around that, and if you would be going from a bare field to alfalfa in the spring, would be to use oats. That will freeze out, oats and tillage radish, and you can plant into that without herbicide if that's the only issues you have. So there's ways to use pieces of this in organic too. We just can't quite figure out the way to get the complete no-till and not somewhere in that system having to use a chemical. But the cover crops, the suppression of the weeds by cereal rye, for example, is real. My 7-acre food plot, well, 2 of them, but this one was 4 acres, was too wet in the fall. They cleared it. They were going to come back one more time, and it rained to level out better, didn't get leveled. I had to hand spin the seed on that, and I had a mixture. I had triticale in it, I had cereal rye in it, I had a bunch of other stuff. I could see exactly around this one tree where I didn't get cover crop seed, and I had dock, and I had thistle, and I had poke. The 3 worst ones that you would have, you know, coming out of the woods going into a cover crop plot or a food plot. I didn't have any of that at all where I had that seed mixture broadcast. Now I don't know a combination of cereal rye and triticale. I'm not sure what it was, except I had no weeds at all. They started appearing afterwards, but it really did suppress the weeds. And one thing I am disappointed with the sorghum, we're not getting very good weed suppression with our sorghum. I don't know if you have any, work with that at all or not. I always thought sorghum was pretty dominant plant, but we're getting thistle, we're getting plantain and dandelion in our sorghum.
I haven't seen weeds in the sorghum plots that I've looked at.
Okay.
It's been pretty.
Well,
The other thing is, we always thought that for the no-till that you had mostly worked better in the organic no-till through the heavy covers with only the big seeds.
mm-hmm.
But we found sorghum Sudan grass would go through a rolled winter rye and come right up. So we
Okay.
actually had a weed suppressing mat,
yeah.
and the sorghum Sudan grass was able to push right through that.
Well, we'll have to look at that. Now we're harvesting that right now, that cereal rye before we plant, but that might help.
Yeah, so we rolled, it took 2 rolls, but then the second roll seeded into it, and it came right up through.
Wow.
Of course, you're going to tie up, you got to have plenty of nitrogen because you're tying up some of that.
Yeah. Well, my brother and I and my brother sort of understands all this stuff, but he really doesn't. We had a discussion the other day. We have 15 acres of stuff that high there. That's what that field that came out of. Are we going to harvest it or aren't we? I think we're going to harvest this weekend. But I'm trying to tell him, that could give us 5 bushel soybean yield next year if we don't harvest that. But he didn't get it. And he said, well, you couldn't plant rye through that. Well, I think I can plant rye through that. The drill will make its path and it'll grow.
The other thing we were finding is planting into the standing crop is a lot easier on the equipment than the roll crop, and that would make a huge difference. Actually, that was the other point, right? Is that starting to plant with everything standing, and I think that's the same as planting with the green. The planters work better.
Yeah, it's still standing.
Yeah,
Exactly.
you're not fighting it with all the down. Trying to.
Right. Yeah. Good discussion. So again, you can't go home and do all this stuff, but put it up there, and some of it'll come to play somewhere down the road for you. At least I hope it will. Any other comments on where we are so far? That's the cover where I have annual ryegrass and annual ryegrass and radish into alfalfa. And it was interesting that spring. The competition was the annual ryegrass going to get higher than the alfalfa or vice versa. Essentially, they were about the same height. I have a couple close-ups here. You can see what that was like. It's pretty dense. That's our planter. We planted into that. We got excellent stand. Again, it's all standing. And that was beginning of May. That was a year, about 4 years ago or 5, where it was so wet we couldn't plant anything until that first week of May. Then we planted alfalfa, we planted corn, we planted beans all that same week. But that's what we planted into. And hopefully that annual ryegrass was taking up some nitrogen too from the alfalfa. We were never able to quite ascertain that. But we have spike closing wheels in the back of the planter. We have drag chains. And you see a little bit of soil there, but that's pretty well all covered yet. And so that's truly planting into green. This was the Penn State interseeder. There's a picture back on that table, and maybe you've heard, I don't know, I think there's one somewhere up here, isn't there?
We've been doing, and the aerial seeding, started with the helicopters.
Okay, is it working?
It's working. Yeah, great. This is the first year. It's coming up beautifully.
We cannot get consistent enough to say this is what we want to do.
Yeah.
We've had slugs. We get a wet fall, we had an issue with slugs. And we have a dry year, and I don't know what the answer is to that. I really don't. Somebody, I talked to a fellow that flew for us for a number of years, he thinks the heavier soils is more difficult than lighter textured soils, which would make some sense. We are doing it mainly in the no-till. With the residue, I would think that's a plus, but I don't know.
There's only 1 year so far. So.
Well, let us know if it keeps working, because we got to learn. Was it helicopter or fixed wing?
Helicopter.
Okay. We haven't been able to talk them into using the helicopter. They all want to use fixed wing.
I think there's something with the prop wash helps dry stuff down too.
That's possible. This is in corn? Or?
In corn, it's almost all in corn.
Well, surprisingly enough, you'd think it would do better in beans, but the results have been better in corn than beans for some reason. And I've talked to a lot of the folks at the National No-Till meeting from the Midwest, and they're making it work out there in big acres, but we can't seem to. Here's just something you may not have thought about. Essentially, the soil organic matter that you see increases from using these systems, it's really from the roots more of the plant than it is the top part of the plant. Top part of the plant should provide the canopy and the cover, but the roots is really what helps produce the soil organic matter. There's just number there to show that. So the roots are very important. And one thing about the sorghum, every time you cut that, it pushes out new roots, so we get more root system with that. I'm pretty happy with that. It's important to know carbon to nitrogen ratios with the cover crops and with the different plants. I'm not going to spend any time on that because that's an hour discussion of its own. But in my situation where we got alfalfa, we got soybeans, the only grass crop, the only really carbon crop is our sorghum Sudan grass or sorghum. We need carbon. We aren't increasing our soil organic matters much above 3, and my take on it is primarily because we don't have the carbon there. We've got the nitrogen from the legume crops, but we don't have the carbon. That's why I interseed small grains into alfalfa at every opportunity. Third year of alfalfa, I'll run oats in after probably the third or fourth cutting, harvest it together, and the next year we still have alfalfa. The fourth year I'll run wheat in the fall like I did, and we'll harvest that in the spring, and then it'll go to sorghum Sudan grass. But we're getting a grass in there to help increase the carbon a little bit. Just water holding capacity with different percent organic matter. And you think about, you're going to have less runoff if you can hold more soil moisture. So that's a win-win. Here's your graph that's I held up a little while ago. I don't really have time to go into that much, but it's just, again, shows you where and this is reversed, so here's the fall and there's the spring. But you can see, according to Doug's numbers, we get more nitrogen uptake from that cover crop in the spring between March and here probably, a little later than March, but up until the time the corn starts taking it up with that cover crop that time of the year. The fall, and what Doug says is your temperatures are going down, so there's really not a lot happening out here in the fall. Now, if you put manure out there in August, yes, But if you're putting it out there typically in the end of September, October, November, you just don't have that much to happen. This was a thing that Penn State did that proved that corn yield after red clover was impacted not only by the nitrogen from the corn, but by something else from having the red clover there. In other words, they kept adding more nitrogen fertilizer, and you can see the upper line there where the red clover was, it stayed higher than the lower line where they just added the nitrogen. So there was something going on in the soil that red clover helped increase that corn yield. I won't take time to go into that. Ohio, even in their corn bean rotation, adding wheat, they could do some of these things. Dave Brandt, you may have heard the name Dave Brandt in Ohio. He's a leading researcher, a farmer, but doing a lot of research out there. The system. Continuous no-till's a must. This system supports making no-till work better, making no-till work, I really would say. Management replaces tillage time. We have to be good managers. I know some farmers will never be good no-tillers because they're not good managers. Not everyone can make this work. But again, the management can help replace the cost for all farm inputs in terms of nutrients and some pesticides. We manage our soils to optimize our returns with diversity, continuous soil armor, and no-till. And we're increasing the beneficial microbes and insects. So do we want to keep doing what we've been doing, or do we want to move out and try something new? So this is phase one of thinking about moving out and trying something new. There's the websites that I have that are on your handout. Questions, comments? I'm done.